Most of us are taught from a young age that our actions not only affect our own lives, but also those of the people around us, such as our friends and family. Not everyone takes these values to heart though, and in some cases, criminals knowingly allow the wrong person to be convicted for a crime they didn't commit. Stalkers ruin the lives of their victims, and people ridicule others who've been through traumatic experiences, forever changing their lives for the worse. Number 10. In 2007, 21-year-old Meredith Kircher had dreams of becoming a journalist for the European Union, and to pursue that career, she relocated to Italy from her hometown of Seattle, Washington. Her family describes her as a caring, witty, and popular person who took her studies very seriously. Before moving to Italy, she'd started studying at the University of Leeds, where she focused on her European Studies degree. But she was also studying cinema, politics, and modern history. She was also no stranger to Italy, as she'd spent a summer there living with family in Campania when she was 15 years old. She enjoyed that experience to the fullest and always dreamed of going back, which she did 6 years later. She specifically chose to study in Perugia since she believed it was a safer area than Rome or Milan, but that very decision would lead to her losing her life. After making the move, she spoke to her family on the phone every day. Before long, she met a man named Giacomo Silenzi, and the pair started dating. She was sharing an apartment with a fellow American student named Amanda Knox, and by all accounts, the two could not have been more different. Amanda was an extrovert, while Meredith was more reserved and calm, but they got along and were often seen thrift shopping together. Though they did have a few minor disagreements, as would be expected when people are living in close quarters. On the night of the 1st of November, 2007, Meredith spent the night out with 3 British women. They first went to a restaurant for dinner, and then went out to celebrate Halloween. When she got back to the apartment, no one was home, as Amanda was staying over at her boyfriend's house, and the 2 Italian women who also lived there had gone out of town. The next morning, Amanda returned to the apartment and walked into a grisly scene. She noticed that the front door was open and that there were drops of biological material in the bathroom. She believed Meredith was asleep since her bedroom door was locked, but when she couldn't wake her after taking a shower, she called her boyfriend, Raphael, but he was unable to break the door down. They then called the police, who successfully entered the room, and there they found Meredith deceased. She was wrapped in a duvet, and it was clear she'd been attacked with a sharp blade. Amanda and Raphael were arrested and put on trial, as the police believed that they had assaulted her before ending her life. Amanda was interrogated for 52 hours, but she maintained her innocence. Though after buckling under pressure, she signed a confession that placed her at least in the apartment at the time of the attack. 21-year-old Rudy Gede was also arrested since his fingerprints were found at the scene and his DNA was found on Meredith's body. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison, but the authorities were adamant that Amanda and Raphael were also involved. After 2 years in prison while their trials commenced, they were both found guilty and sentenced to more than 2 decades behind bars. 4 years later, they finally managed to appeal the sentence, and both Amanda and Raphael were acquitted. But in 2013, they were retried and found guilty again, since the court would not comprehend that Gede had carried out the attack on his own. In March of 2015, the convictions were finally and permanently overturned thanks to flaws in the investigation and a lack of evidence. Gede only served 13 years in prison before he was released, but thanks to the media storm that resulted from Meredith's murder, Amanda's reputation was ruined, and it would only be years later that she'd be able to carry on with her life as normal. Number 9. The 1976 case of the Circleville letters is a very strange one, during which for almost 20 years, someone intended to ruin the lives of several people, and to this day, their identity remains a mystery. It all started one morning in Circleville, Ohio, when a bus driver named Mary Gillespie checked her mail as she did most mornings. When she opened one of the envelopes she found in her mailbox, she was surprised to find a handwritten note that accused her of having an affair with the superintendent of schools, Gordon Massey. It further stated that the author of the note had been watching her house and that they knew Mary had children. The postmark on the envelope was from Columbus, Ohio, but since there was no return address, the author couldn't be traced. Mary received yet another letter a day later and decided not to tell anyone about them, but then her husband Ron also received one. It revealed the affair to him and stated that if he didn't stop Mary from being unfaithful, his life would be in danger. Furthermore, if the affair continued, the author would go public and broadcast the scandal on television, radio, and on billboards. Ron decided to write back and claimed to know who the sender of the letters was, since Mary had her suspicions, and for a few weeks, no more letters were received. But in August of the next year, Ron received a phone call from the author, during which he was told that his truck was being watched. Ron grabbed his firearm and ran out to confront the culprit. He got into the truck and raced away from the house, after which he crashed into a tree and lost his life. Strangely, it was discovered that he had discharged the weapon once before crashing, but his passing was ruled an accident since he was inebriated at the time. But this was not the end of the mystery. In the weeks that followed, several more people in Circleville started receiving similar letters in which they were told that the local sheriff had covered something up, and he later admitted that foul play was initially suspected in Ron's passing. Mary would eventually admit to the affair with the superintendent, but she claimed that only started after she'd received the letters. The case only got stranger when the author started leaving messages via signs next to the road on Mary's bus route. On one occasion, she got angry and decided to remove one of the signs, but she found that it had been booby-trapped with a firearm, and luckily she didn't tear the sign down all the way, or she too would have lost her life. The weapon was traced to Paul Freshout, who claimed that it had been stolen from his house. After he was asked to copy the letters, his handwriting was a match, and an expert named him as the author, and he was arrested. His boss also told the police that he didn't show up for work on the day Mary decided to rip the sign down, and after being found guilty, he was handed a sentence of between 7 to 24 years in prison. While he was incarcerated, hundreds of more letters were sent to people in Circleville, even while Paul was in solitary confinement, and he even received a few, which indicated he'd been wrongfully convicted. The letters continued to be sent for almost 20 years until the day Paul was released on parole in 1994. Many people believe that Paul was indeed guilty, but he maintained his innocence until his passing, and the true identity of the Circleville letter writer remains unknown. Number 8. Being wrongfully accused and convicted of a crime must be a horrible experience, but it must be even worse when the accused is still a young person with their entire life ahead of them, only for it to be unexpectedly and wrongfully derailed. The case of the Central Park Five has become one of the most famous examples of a miscarriage of justice, and it all started on the 19th of April, 1989, at about 9 p.m. that night. New York police received reports that a large group of teenage boys, about 30 in all, had entered Central Park and that they were causing all kinds of trouble. Some witnesses would later describe being approached by the teenagers, all of which were either intimidated or assaulted. One woman, Patricia Maley, better known to her friends as Trish, was hit over the head, which caused her to lose consciousness, and after being dragged away from the roadside, she was assaulted further. She was found at around 1:30 the next morning, barely clinging to life. 5 teenagers, Raymond Santana, Kevin Richardson, Anton McCrae, Youssef Salam, and Corey Wise were arrested and subjected to hours of continuous interrogation. They were told that were they to confess to carrying out the attack, they'd be allowed to go home, and so they agreed, but signed their confessions under duress. Their confessions would later be recanted after it came to light that investigators had pressured and deceived them into signing. As soon as their trial started, they were dubbed the Central Park Five by the media. All 5 of the accused professed their innocence, but they were nevertheless charged with 2 types of assault, attempted murder, and rioting. The prosecution relied on the signed and taped confessions that had been spuriously obtained, since DNA evidence found on Trish didn't match any of the accused. Salam would later state that during the interrogations, he could hear investigators assaulting Weiss while questioning him, and he was told that it would be his turn next. All 5 were found guilty, and on the 14th of January, 1990, they were each sentenced to 13 years in prison. it wouldn't be until 2002 that the truth behind the crime came to light. While serving time in prison, a man named Matias Reyes admitted he was the one who attacked Trish and that he had acted alone that night. His DNA was compared to that was found at the scene, and it came back as a match. The teenagers were eventually released, although they were now full-grown men, and then they filed a lawsuit against the city, which saw them receive $41 million in compensation. In 2016, they were awarded another $3.9 million by the New York Court of Claims. Number 7. In 1961, husband and wife Betty and Barney Hill were living in Portsmouth, New Hampshire on the east coast of the US. In September of that year, they decided to go on a trip to Montreal in Canada for a delayed honeymoon to Niagara Falls. And on the night of the 19th, they were driving along a desolate road in the White Mountains on their way home. At the time, Betty was employed as a social worker, and Barney had a job as a postal worker. They were eager to get home after a long journey. They'd enjoyed dinner in Vermont before setting off at around 11 p.m. and estimated that they would arrive in Portsmouth at around 2 a.m. But as they drove along that road, they realized that a strange light in the sky was following their car. The further they drove, the brighter the light became, and at first they assumed that it was a helicopter or a military craft. But when the light continued to follow them, they decided to step out of the car to investigate, and what happened next changed their lives forever. Looking at the light through a pair of binoculars, they realized that it was not coming from any normal aircraft, but a strange spinning object that was hovering in the sky. They jumped back in the car and drove to Route 3 in Lincoln, where the light came ever closer to the car, eventually hovering about 100 feet above them. Barney got out of the vehicle with his firearm in hand and was shocked to see a massive, flat craft above him. He tried to lift his weapon in defense, but found that he was unable to. He could see strange beings in the craft's windows who told him to put his binoculars down, but he managed to run back to the car and flee. But as he drove on, he and Betty became aware of beeping noises coming from the trunk, and before long they started feeling sleepy and lost consciousness. When they woke up, they were back in their house in Portsmouth with no recollection of how they got there. Betty found tears in her dress. Barney's shoes were worse for wear, and neither of their wristwatches were working. They started having terrible nightmares and eventually decided to consult with a psychiatrist. They underwent hypnotherapy, during which it was revealed that the craft had landed on their car and the strange beings had put them to sleep. They were taken into the craft via a ramp, after which all kinds of tests were performed on them. Samples of their hair, skin, and nails were collected, and they were poked with needles on several parts of their bodies. Betty was shown a map of space indicating the areas that the beings had traveled to, and later she decided to contact the Air Force, a decision that she would live to regret. Their claims were dismissed after they were interviewed, and the psychiatrist that they'd been seeing started to claim that they were either delusional or that they were using the abduction tale to cover up deep-seated issues in their relationship. He even went as far as accusing Barney of being homosexual. For many years after the fact, and even after Barney's passing, they were subjected to ridicule and were never taken seriously. This caused serious damage to their reputations and credibility, but neither Betty nor Barney ever recanted their version of events, despite the impact that their claims had on the rest of their lives. Number 6. John Hastings is yet another man who was sent to prison for a crime that he didn't commit. And despite repeatedly requesting for DNA testing to be done to prove his innocence, he was ignored until the truth was finally revealed in 2001. John's case started in 1983, when a woman named Roberta Weidermeyer was found deceased inside the trunk of her car in Inglewood, Los Angeles. She'd been assaulted and attacked with a firearm, and investigators were able to collect DNA belonging to the culprit from her remains. The resulting investigation was fraught with incompetence, and before long, John was taken into custody with no real physical evidence indicating that he was the attacker. He also provided the police with an alibi for the time at which the attack took place, but this was conveniently left out at his trial. His DNA was never compared to that found at the scene, and the prosecution relied heavily on his testimony of Roberta's husband, Billy, and a friend, who went out looking for her. and who, upon spotting her stolen car, gave chase. During the chase, the culprit fired at them, and Billy was injured. They were forced to give up the chase, and it was only later that the car with Roberto's remains was discovered. He was charged with special circumstance murder, which means the authorities believed there were aggravating circumstances involved, and hence John would be judged more harshly, and it was suggested that he received the death penalty. These types of cases usually involve a premeditated crime or a kidnapping that led to the victim's passing, but John maintained that he was innocent throughout. His pleas, though, fell on deaf ears, and the trial went ahead. The first time around, the jury, hearing his case, became deadlocked, which meant that a second trial would have to be held. In 1988, a different jury found him guilty, and he was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. Understandably, this left him in a state of disbelief, as he knew that he was innocent, but for the next 38 years, he remained incarcerated. 13 years after he was sentenced, John requested that the DNA collected from the scene be compared to his, since he knew this would exonerate him, but his request was denied. In 2021, John filed a claim of innocence with the District Attorney's Conviction Integrity Unit. DNA test subsequently revealed no match to John, but instead matched a man named Packnett, who had committed an identical crime, including placing the victim in their car's trunk. John was released with $38 million in compensation for the 4 decades of wrongful imprisonment. A detective later admitted to burying some of the evidence. Packnett died in 2021 while incarcerated, so he could never be tried for the crime. Number 5. On a Sunday evening, the 13th of February, 2000, 53-year-old Jane Dorotik contacted the police in Valley Center, California, in a state of panic to report that her husband, 55-year-old Robert, had gone missing. She explained that he left the house as per usual to go for his jog at around 1 p.m., and then he never returned. At the time, Jane was a horse boarder and trainer, and she was planning to start her own business that would see her constructing horse jumping structures that would be used in training and competitions. She was also working for a mental health services company, for which she served as a high-ranking executive. As soon as the missing person report was received, officers were dispatched to conduct a search along Robert's usual jogging route, and with the use of sniffer dogs, his jacket was found lying by the side of North Wolford Lake Road. Early the next morning, Jane's worst fears were realized when she received the news that Robert had been found deceased in a wooded area about half a mile from the spot where his jacket was located. He'd been badly assaulted, and a rope was found around his neck. It was determined that his life was ended via strangulation, and Jane and their daughter were left shattered. When the house was searched, a section of carpet in the couple's bedroom was found to contain biological material, and when further traces of this were found, a more thorough search ensued. More biological material was found on the ceiling, nightshade, lampshade, a comforter on their bed, a few magazines, and a pillow sham. They also discovered the same material on the headboard, the underside of the mattress, and a towel that was discovered when the mattress was flipped over. Even more was found in the stairwell, in the storeroom under the bathroom, and in their daughter's room. In an effort to explain this, the family told investigators that their dog had been suffering from an injury to its dew claw, which is the smaller claw that can be found further up a dog's leg. Their other dog had been suffering from an abscess on its snout, and they added that Robert had suffered a nosebleed in the bedroom days earlier. It was then determined that Jane's horse trailer left the tire marks that were found next to Robert's body, and she was arrested. It was claimed that she ended his life in the house, and that she then disposed of his body where it was found. At her trial, it was suggested the couple had been arguing over money, and it was mentioned that both Jane and Robert had taken out large insurance policies on the other. The trial lasted for 4 weeks, during which the evidence mounted against Jane. She was found guilty and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. 16 years later, she and the Loyola Project for the Innocent reviewed the mountain of evidence that was presented at the trial, and it was revealed that the biological material that was found at the scene was never tested. It would then come to light that many of the stains found in the house were not even biological material, and Jane was granted a retrial. In 2022, just as the trial was about to start, the charges against her were dropped, as it was found that the evidence presented the first time around was no longer reliable. Number 4. When 23-year-old Hannah Moore graduated from university, she had one dream that she wanted to pursue: starting a career in the fashion industry. She contacted several companies and was eventually offered an intern position with the Algeri Jewelry Company. While she wasn't being paid much, she saw it as a good opportunity, and in 2015 she was overjoyed at the news that she'd be attending the London Fashion Week. Once there, she spent most of her time in designer showrooms where she looked to engage with potential buyers. When she ran into a friend of a friend, he introduced Hannah to a man from Hong Kong called Kin Hung. He seemed genuinely interested in the jewelry, and after taking a selfie together, Hannah provided him with her contact details in case he wanted to make a purchase at some point. This was a decision that would change her life forever, and one that she desperately wished she could take back. For the next 2 years, they developed a friendship and would often go to expensive restaurants and VIP fashion shows together. But then things took a sinister turn. Hannah started receiving threatening messages with abusive language, and the unknown person who was sending them made it clear that they'd been watching her for some time. At one point, they managed to hack into her phone and, even worse, her bank account. Her phone account was terminated without cause, and on more than one occasion, she was left stranded without any means to get home or contact anyone for help. At one point, the culprit sent her an email containing a photo of her sister's house's front door, and her father's phone was also hacked. Her brother received papers at his home threatening legal action against him, and the stalker started setting up fake email accounts in Hannah's name in order to impersonate her. One of these email accounts was used to claim that Hannah was an escort and that she was offering certain services. The stalker set up fake WhatsApp profiles in her name and started sending messages to her friends and family, in which she confessed to committing crimes such as tax fraud, while still receiving threatening messages that she was going to be harmed. When it was all too much to bear, she contacted the police with all of the evidence that she had gathered. A suspect was identified, but when the police arrived at his house, he'd gone out, and they decided to close the case due to what they called evidential difficulties. In the meantime, Kin's behavior towards Hannah had started to change, and she became frightened of him. She asked him not to contact her again, and she moved out of the house that he had arranged for her to live in. At first, he apologized for his behavior, but then he demanded that she return furniture that he had gifted to her. She agreed, but Kin would not reply to the messages asking where the items were to be sent. She moved into her father's house and refused to go anywhere alone, since she feared for her life. Hannah kept reporting these incidents to the police, but they closed her case prematurely more than 10 times, as they were unable to locate Kin. Before long, Hannah was forced to leave the country, leaving behind her dream job in hopes that the stalking would stop. But for the next 4 years, it continued unabated. At one point, she was receiving harassing phone calls every 5 minutes, and she felt trapped. Eventually, she and a friend named Carol decided to create a podcast about the case. But before they could do so, the messages and threats suddenly stopped, likely because the culprit got wind of the idea and was afraid of being exposed. Number 3. As a child, Richard Phillips did not have the easiest life. He was born in Alabama but moved to Detroit with his mother and siblings when he was still young, and there he lived in terrible conditions. While in 10th grade, he decided to drop out of school, a decision that would later be one of the biggest mistakes of his life. He soon met a woman, and after getting married, the couple had children. He managed to land a job with Chrysler, where he worked as a typist, but in 1970, his life was uprooted when he was arrested for armed robbery in Oakland County. He was found guilty and sentenced to 15 years in prison. While still incarcerated in 1972, he and Richard Palumbo were charged with ending the life of a man named Gregory Harris. He was charged with murder and conspiracy to commit murder, but he professed his innocence. At their trial, Harris's brother-in-law, Fred Mitchell, testified against the two men, and based on his testimony, they were found guilty. Richard was sentenced to life in prison without a possibility of parole, and he would spend the next 46 years behind bars, knowing that he was innocent. Then, in 2012, Palumbo would finally decide to do the right thing. He contacted the parole board and revealed that he and the key witness, Mitchell, had committed both crimes, the murder and robbery, and that he didn't even know Richard at the time. He stated that Harris and Mitchell were embroiled in a dispute over money, and after the pair ended his life, it was decided that Richard should be blamed for the crime so that they could escape prosecution. The Wayne County Prosecutor's Office Conviction Integrity Unit decided to investigate these claims, and they were found to be true. At last, it was realized that Richard was an innocent man who had needlessly spent 4.5 decades behind bars, and he was released in 2018, but without a penny to his name, though he would later receive compensation of $1.5 million from the state of Michigan. But Palumbo has since passed away. Number 2. On the 6th of April, 1976, an incident occurred that would change the life of Kash Register forever. That afternoon, it was reported that 78-year-old Jack Sasson had been attacked with a firearm while he was sitting in his car outside his house in Los Angeles. He was found by his wife, Renee, who then contacted the police, and when officers arrived at the scene, it was determined Jack was no longer alive. It was also determined he'd been fired at from close range, and he'd been struck 5 times. A witness, 19-year-old Brenda Anderson, who lived nearby, told the police that she heard the sound of the weapon being discharged, and when she looked out of her window, she saw an African-American man running away from the scene. He then stopped, ran back to Jack's car, and fired at him again before fleeing. Brenda was asked to come to the West Los Angeles police station, where she was shown photos of 6 men, and she stated that Kash, who was a former high school classmate of hers, was the man she saw fleeing the scene. Another witness, Elliot Singleton, also came forward, and he was shown the same 6 photos, and he also identified Kash as the culprit. He added that at the time of the incident, he was busy painting his house when he witnessed the crime, and he even chased after the attacker as he fled. He pursued the man for several blocks, but was forced to give up the chase when the man turned and pointed his firearm at him. When Kash's house was searched, no evidence linking him to the crime was found, and when Jack's car was dusted for fingerprints, some were found but they did not belong to Kash. At the house, investigators collected 3 brown hats, pinstripe pants, and a burgundy shirt. These items were very similar to the clothes that the attacker was wearing, and when a small amount of what was assumed to be biological material was found on the pants, Kash's fate was seemingly sealed. Kash told investigators that he'd been at the local unemployment office when the crime was committed, and that he had at long last received a possible job offer that very day. For the rest of that afternoon, he stayed at home with his girlfriend, where the pair watched TV and had some lunch. His girlfriend confirmed this, and records from the unemployment office corroborated Kash's alibi. Nevertheless, he was arrested and charged with ending Jack's life, and at his trial, the prosecution leaned heavily on accounts given by the 2 witnesses who had identified him as the attacker. At the first hearing, Brenda seemed less certain that Kash was the attacker, and she admitted that when she saw her former classmate's photo, she'd become confused. But at the trial, she was adamant that she had identified the correct person, and Singleton also remained steadfast in his testimony. Kash was found guilty, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This sentence was later amended to 27 years without the possibility of early release in 1993. And for the next 20 years, he attended 11 unsuccessful parole hearings, all while professing his innocence. Then, in 2011, Brenda's sister Sheila came across a website detailing the location of prisoners, and she was shocked to find that Kash was still incarcerated. She'd always believed that Brenda had lied to the police, since she told her family outright that she had never seen the attacker's face. Sheila decided to take action, and with the help of others, managed to have this case reopened. It would then come to light that another witness had ruled Kash out after coming face to face with the actual attacker. But detectives threatened her with jail time if she refused to testify against him as a culprit. With the help of the Loyola Project for the Innocent, Kash was granted a new trial, and it came to light that Singleton had not only not seen the attacker, but that he never even chased after him. Kash was finally exonerated after 34 years in prison, and he was awarded $16.7 million by the city of Los Angeles. Number 1. On the 8th of October, 1996, Anthony Mullen was working as a parking lot attendant in West Philadelphia when he was attacked by someone with a firearm. When the police arrived at the scene, they collected shell casings and a firearm that had become lodged under his body, and it was determined that when it was last fired, it was jammed. But the shell casings that were found at the scene were from 2 different caliber weapons, and no suspect was identified. It wasn't until February of the next year that the case saw some progress when David Williams and Mark Manigault were arrested for robbery. When they were questioned, Williams claimed that a man named John Miller had ended Mullen's life, and he knew this since John was a friend of his. With this information in hand, officers tracked John down, and he was taken into custody. But at the preliminary hearing, Williams recanted his statements and made it clear that he had only implicated John after investigators threatened him with jail time, and he was intimidated until he pointed the finger at his friend. He added that he and John had been at loggerheads after he found out that John had stolen his pager, and he wanted to get back at him out of anger. A man named Michael Arnold served as a witness and stated that he had exited his house after hearing a fight in the neighborhood about 2 months before the attack, and that he was carrying his firearm. He added that at some point he dropped the weapon, which was then picked up by the accused. The day before Mullen lost his life, Arnold ran into John and told him that he still had the weapon. With very little evidence against him, John was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Unwilling to accept his wrongful incarceration, he immediately started filing post-conviction petitions, during which he presented evidence of his own. John's mother had received a letter from Williams in which he stated that he was the one who ended Mullen's life, and he apologized for lying to the police to save his own skin. But Williams was threatened with the death penalty, and a judge ruled that he was not a credible witness. In 2009, John contacted the Pennsylvania Innocence Project, and during their investigation, Williams revealed that he'd also implicated another man named Jack Williams in another murder that he'd committed in order to receive a lesser sentence in an unrelated case against him. For several more years, John and the project fought for his release, and in 2019 he was finally granted a new trial. It was determined that John had done enough to prove his innocence, and the decision was made not to go to trial. He was released on the 31st of July 2019 after serving 21 years, and in 2021, he was awarded $4.6 million for his wrongful conviction. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knox, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.